Happy Tuesday, April 21st, Mitchell Mustangs. Thank you so much for watching another video. Just a few things before we start. So Dr. Skeen asked me to let you know that she has ordered the books that she mentioned in her video last Friday, and she is waiting for Amazon to deliver them to her. We know that with everything that's going on in the world, shipping is taking a little bit longer than normal. So don't worry. The books are on the way to her, and once they get to her, then she'll be able to turn them around and get them out to the students who have emailed her in hopes to get their blank books so that you are able to write your children's book about this moment in history. Also, Mrs. Clifford has a video each day that is posted along with this video for all Mitchell Mustangs. Mrs. Clifford is just showing her thinking about holes and how she might write a reader's response. Remember that we would like you to write your reader's response on your independent reading book. So this is all fantastic. And if you have any questions, email your LC teachers because we are available to help you. That's what we're here for. So, oh my goodness, I'm so excited about this book, Holes. Reading it yesterday, I'm already wondering, okay, what's going to happen next? Because it starts right from the beginning. It's pretty fascinating what's going on with our protagonist, Stanley Yelnats. So today, last night I was thinking about, so we met Stanley, we met his family, and his great-great-great-grandfather who was dirty, rotten, blah, 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 because he didn't fulfill something he was supposed to fulfill. And now there's this curse that they really don't believe, but they kind of believe. So now, because I am a reader of fiction, I know that characters are being introduced. We know the setting. We talked a little bit about the setting yesterday. We're in Texas. That is the whole reason why Louis Sachar wrote the book. He started with the setting, his own personal experience of moving from California to Texas and the heat. So I'm anticipating some heat at Camp Green Lake. So today, as we read, let's listen in as we meet the characters, because great readers, we understand that every character is placed inside of the story for a reason. Every character is a part of the story that fulfills the whole story, brings it all together. So I'm so curious to know, as we meet these characters, why did the author create this character? How is this character lending to the whole story? So these are the things I'm thinking about as we read today. So let's get started. Let's meet these characters that I anticipate are going to be coming to life. Chapter 4. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and led him off the bus. He'd been on the bus for over 8 hours. "Be careful," the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. "Thanks for the ride," he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handkerchief had been. The land was barren and desolate. He could see a few rundown buildings and some tents. Farther away, there was a cabin beneath 2 tall trees. These 2 trees were the only plant life he could see. There weren't even weeds. The guard led Stanley to a small building. A sign on front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake Juvenile Correction Facility." Next to it was another sign which declared that it was a violation of the Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosives, weapons, drugs, or alcohol onto the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help but think, well, duh! The guard led Stanley into the building where he felt the welcome relief of air conditioning. A man was sitting with his feet up on a desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited while the bus guard gave the man some papers to sign. "That's a lot of sunflower seeds," the bus guard said. Stanley noticed a burlap sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to the desk. "I quit smoking last month," said the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and as he signed his name, the snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat a sack of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that the one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and said the other was for the driver. "9 hours here and now 9 hours back," the guard grumbled. "What a day." Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spit sunflower seed shells into the waste paper basket. Then he walked around the desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me by my name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that was really the man's name. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was then given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of a long-sleeve orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made of heavy plastic, which unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn on the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him he should wear 1 set to work in and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed. Then the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. "You are to dig 1 hole every day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every direction. Your shovel is your measuring stick. Breakfast is at 4:30 a.m. Stanley must have looked surprised because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they started early to avoid the hottest part of the day. "No one is going to be your babysitter," he added. "The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you will be out in the sun. If you dig up anything interesting, you are to report it to me or any other counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours." Stanley nodded to show he understood. "This isn't a Girl Scout camp," said Mr. Sir. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside into the blazing heat. "Take a good look around you," Mr. Sir said. "What do you see?" Stanley looked out across the vast wasteland. The air seemed thick with heat and dirt. "Not much," he said, then hastily added, "Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir laughed. "You see any guard towers?" "No." "How about any electric fences?" "No, Mr. Sir." "There's no fence at all, is there?" "No, Mr. Sir." "You want to run away?" Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure what he meant. "If you want to run away, go ahead, start running. I'm not going to stop you." Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. "I see you're looking at my gun. Don't worry, I'm not going to shoot you." He tapped his holster. "This is for yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you." "I'm not going to run away," Stanley said. "Good thinking," said Mr. Sir. "Nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence. You know why? Because we've got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be buzzard food in 3 days. Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange, carrying shovels, dragging themselves toward the tents. "You thirsty?" asked Mr. Sir. "Yes, Mr. Sir," Stanley said gratefully. Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. Whew, Mr. Sir. Okay, I'm thinking about Mr. Sir. This is not the welcome that I believe Stanley was hoping for. He doesn't seem too friendly. He doesn't seem that he cares very much about Stanley. So let's read on and let's see some of these other characters. Chapter 5. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had a black letter on it. A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselor slept in E. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendanski as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words. Pan-dance-ski. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't really bad, said Mr. Pendanski. He just has been in a mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendanski said. I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think that he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, said his counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them, Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and one kid was black. What happened to Barf Bag? Asked the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendanski. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendanski. My name's not Alan, the boy said. I'm Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could even see out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led him inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the next to it. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Pendanski asked. Barf Bag slept here, said X-Ray, kicking out one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles on one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendanski as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendanski. However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hard-working members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big, fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendanski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Pendanski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pendanski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have any questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a line thin of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendanski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendanski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him, do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled around, grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. Oh, Mitchell Mustangs. Whew. We have met some interesting characters today. So we've met Mr. Sir, who seemed very gruff. He didn't offer Stanley anything to drink when he looked thirsty. We've met Mr. Pendanski, who seems like he might be a helpful counselor, but not so sure about that. And these other boys that we've met, oh my goodness, Zigzag, Magnet, Armpit. Where do these names come from? And what really happened to Barfbag, I wonder? And also Zero. I'm so curious to read on tomorrow to see about these characters. And I'm wondering how Stanley will fit inside, because we're already seeing by the way that Louis Sachar describes Stanley that he sees the good in people. We learned that yesterday. And we saw that again today, where he made little comments of, well, maybe this isn't so bad. The hopeful comments of, maybe it's okay that I'm sleeping in a cot of someone named Barfbag. Or maybe he's grouchy because he quit smoking. Maybe that's why Mr. Sir is like this. So as great readers, we follow these different characters. Mitchell Mustangs, as you read your independent reading books today, wherever you are in your book, whether it be in the beginning, middle, and the end, think about these characters. Think about how the characters support. Right now, we know who the protagonist is. In our book is Stanley. Who's the protagonist in your book, and how are the other characters supporting your protagonist? Do you know who the antagonists are? I am anticipating that the warden is the antagonist in this book. Just because what was said today of, you don't need to worry about Mr. Sir, you only need to worry about the warden, and don't make the warden angry. So I'm thinking the warden is our antagonist who will cause some problems. So, thinking about your characters today, enjoy your independent reading book. Thank you so much for writing a reader's response and using your rubric to make sure that you are writing a nicely well-structured response. And don't forget to check in with Mrs. Clifford just to get some ideas of thinking about wholes, but then transfer those ideas over to your own independent reading book if you're trying to think of, what could I write about today? So, The last thing that I want to say to you is stay healthy, happy reading, happy writing, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.